Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's June 20th, 2025. I'm Ness, and joining me is Jeff. We're going to cover a few disparate topics: AI, the kinetic activity in the Middle East between Iran and Israel. Before that, I want to make note of a tendency that repeats over and over about as reliably as any survey tendency in the social sciences does, and that is the tendency for Black Americans to be more open borders and less immigration restrictionists than Hispanics in the United States are. We're going to be looking at a couple of discussions that Tucker Carlson had this week, and one that we won't be looking at in as much detail, but where this question of putative Hispanic and Black opposition to unfettered immigration came up was in Tucker Carlson's conversation with Steve Bannon, where Steve Bannon made the assertion that Hispanic Americans and especially Black Americans are hurt by illegal immigration, and therefore the insinuation is that they're opposed to continued unfettered immigration. But polling consistently shows that not only is that not the case, but that Blacks are more open borders and less immigration restrictionists even than Hispanics. And of course, both are far more supportive of open borders than white Americans are. To illustrate this, I went to the Economist YouGov survey site and pulled up the most recent question about immigration that the outfit put to respondents. And the question here is, quote, "Do you consider it to be acceptable or unacceptable for the government to deport children who are U.S. citizens and have a parent who does not have authorization to live in the United States?" Unquote. So this is getting at the status of the so-called dreamers. Overall, 26% of Americans support the deportation of these so-called dreamers. Just 13% of Blacks do, compared to 22% of Hispanics. So Hispanics are about 50% more immigration restrictionist than Black Americans are. I don't think I have a very satisfying explanation as to why this is the case, but I do think it is worth noting that it is consistently the case. The best I can come up with, and it's not an explanation that bodes very well for the prospects of civic nationalism ever playing out successfully in America, is that Blacks in large part define themselves with a negative identity where they are inherently and instinctively in opposition to whatever Middle America supports. So because immigration restrictionism is coded as a Middle American, middle class, white value, they are instinctively opposed to it. Deporting dreamers is going to have more of a negative impact, presumably, on Hispanics living in the United States than it is on Black Americans living in the United States, many of whom have ancestry that has been in North America longer than the average white American does. That's one of the realities of 21st century America, that the average Black American has a longer ancestral lineage in North America than the average white American does. If you break that down by ethnicity, it varies. For those who are of English or Dutch ancestry, European ancestry, they tend to have the longest ancestral claim to North America. But for those from Italy and Germany and Ireland, on average, those white Americans have been in America for less time than Black Americans have. Switching gears, I want to turn to a topic that we have visited multiple times in previous episodes, and that is on the topic of artificial intelligence, in particular, how that will affect the economic and cultural landscape in the West. And the point of reference here is an article on RT entitled "AI CEO Issues Stark Warning." Quote, "Artificial intelligence could eliminate half of all entry-level white-collar jobs within the next 5 years," the CEO of American AI research company Anthropic, Dario Amodei, has warned. It's encouraging that the CEO is not misanthropic, although it would be a little more heartening if the company was named, say, philanthropic, but it looks like he is staking out a middling position where he is neither for nor against humanity, but he is involved in something that will affect humanity one way or the other. He foresees unemployment getting as high as 20% in the next 5 years as a consequence of the clerical work that AI is poised to eliminate the need for. He warns that systems that are being developed could soon replace workers in technology, finance, law, consulting, and other white-collar professions, particularly entry-level positions. And this potentially will rend the social fabric in America, unlike anything that has happened in the West's history since the Industrial Revolution. And as I've noted before, but I think it bears repeating, the predictions when I was coming of age were that the technological revolution would eliminate the need for menial labor so that people could spend all their time doing creative endeavors, following creative passions, and that the need for the mundane, unglorious work would be replaced by robots. And that may yet come to pass, but it looks like the great economic replacement is going to hit white-collar workers in the digital arena first. It's probably obvious, but if it's not, I'm way out of my league, trying to articulate exactly what the potential of AI is. But large language models are at least something that I can grok, something that I can understand how that would work and how that would be utilized to replace a lot of the clerical tasks, a lot of the white collar cubicle jobs, but adding the third dimension of space for artificial intelligence to operate on robots doing physical tasks is harder to comprehend. When it comes to manufacturing, where the processes are entirely repetitive and pre-planned from beginning to end, it is easier to understand, and that has happened in the manufacturing world. But when it comes to, say, someone investigating an HVAC problem in a residential basement, that is something that it seems is a long way away from AI being able to understand, because there isn't the huge pool of predictive experiences to gather massive amounts of data about and have the robot act productively to figure out why the sump pump isn't working or the breakers keep tripping. I wonder too how this is going to shake out in terms of gauging productivity of human resources for white-collar professions. There is something known as the Pareto principle, which is the idea that 80% of the value comes from about 20% of the inputs. This is particularly applicable to non-physical production processes, so things like computer programming and architectural design. And ostensibly, human resources exists to try to ferret out where that productivity is coming from, even though in reality it often just provides cover for the 80% that produces just 20% of the value. But in any case, the point I think is worth making here is that the 20% that's doing 80% of the value might change to effectively 0% or 1% doing 90% of the value if AI is able to take over the vast majority of the tasks that need to be done in industries like law and consulting and finance. And if this comes to pass, as I suspect that it will, I think that Andrew Yang will be proven to have just been about 10 years ahead of his time, and that the push for a universal basic income will find more support than it did 10 years, 15 years ago. I think it is an idea whose time is about to come, because a massive amount of human work in the modern world is potentially about to become obsolescent. This is knowledge that is particularly useful for those who will be entering the workforce in the coming years and decades. For those creative types and those with a natural predilection and affinity for those types of white-collar occupations, the name of the game is going to be familiarizing oneself with the tools that AI provide and being able to be an efficient manager of the AI tools rather than directly creating the content themselves. And for those of a more mechanical, less abstract bent, I think the future looks quite bright for them. And talking about things that might have been ahead of their time, I think the main character in Office Space, I think he is going to have had it right where the cubicle position is going to be a dead end for a lot of people, but the construction life or the HVAC life or the welder life is going to be quite highly in demand.
There's a lot of potential for implementing large language models in the legal field. Right now, paralegals often draft documents, and that kind of stuff will be able to be done instantly by AI systems. AI systems will be able to scan and instantly find the correct statute, the correct case law, and it will be able to draft up a really well-reasoned, well-written pleading within seconds. And the market will presumably catch up eventually, but right now we're in the sweet spot where an attorney can still get away with charging $300+ per hour for their work, but work that an hour, the amount of work that would have required an hour to accomplish can now be accomplished in 10, 15 minutes, and yet they're still able to charge that full rate. So if you're really smart and on the ball, an attorney, and you're able to leverage these AI systems, you could make a lot of money right now. But again, eventually, presumably, the system will catch up and all that stuff will be taken into account in terms of how much you can charge a client. There is already widespread ubiquitous cheating in colleges using AI LLMs such as ChatGPT, and students are able to basically make it through college without learning anything. And college professors are grappling with how to address this rampant cheating. The solution seems obvious to me. It's fewer take-home assignments, fewer essays, and more in-person examinations. And so you could either have paper exams or exams administered via computer, but that computer is not able to access the internet and have it done in one room at one time in the presence of the professor or a graduate assistant or teaching assistant. That seems like the easy way to solve this, the rampant cheating.
But I wonder if that doesn't just render an already archaic method of communicating information even more archaic and even less relatable to the actual world. Post-academia, taking tests and writing them with pen on notebook paper couldn't be any less representative of what their working lives are going to look like once they graduate from college. And as someone who views higher education predominantly as an expensive, inefficient, imprecise proxy measure of intelligence, say 3 parts intelligence and 1 part conscientiousness, I welcome this existential challenge to the way that higher education is set up in the Western world. To underscore the point that Jeff made previously, an article mentions a study that was published in June of 2024. So this was a year ago, before the year's worth of advancements in the capacity of AI had occurred. The study referenced here generated 100% AI-generated work into professors' grading piles at a university in the United Kingdom, and the professors failed to flag 97% of those 100% generated AI assignments as being guided by AI. So they couldn't flag 97%. They only caught 3% of them. And that was a year ago. And that was without any human editing, because what astute users of AI can do now is have AI generate the work, and then they can go through and make a couple of edits to create, to add a more human and less robotic touch, if that is even deemed necessary. But now AI is to the point where commands can be simply made to ask AI to generate some paper, but to do it in a way that doesn't sound like it is written by AI, to add more parochialisms or even intentional errors here and there. And estimates are now that more than half of all work being done by students in universities is being done with the help of AI, which suggests that we're to a saturation point where students recognize the system is broken and there is no benefit in exerting the effort to try to craft something that at best will be indistinguishable from what everyone else is generating with a couple of keystrokes, something that they're taking hours or days to work on. And so if the realization is that there is no purpose, and the professors are similarly coming to a conclusion that there is no realistic way to prevent this, well, it seems like we're reaching a point where both sides of the equation are wondering what is the purpose of the whole academic setting. At least the pedagogical purpose. There could still be, of course, research purposes, but in terms of academia as an institution that is putatively tasked with imparting knowledge, that seems absurd in a world where the knowledge of 100,000 Library of Alexandrias is not just at our fingertips, as it has been with the advent of the internet and the smartphone, but it now is there to be called upon simply on verbal command. And so if you have access to the collective intelligence and output of all professors who have ever lived across the entire world, why pay tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars and devote years of your life to only dipping your cup in a stream from a few of them as they choose to deliver the information to you, instead of being able to summon the information that all of them have provided through all of time at the snap of your fingers with no expense at all. And so it's taking us to a point where it's laying bare, in my view. I think this has long been the case for most professions, but it is now exposing with little doubt that the only real value of higher education for most people is the credential, and that credential never really had a lot of value, and whatever residual value it did have is vanishing rapidly.
I certainly agree that the value of the credential of a Bachelor of Arts degree in the United States is far, far less than it used to be. But I still, even today, if you have an engineering degree or a degree in mathematics or a hard science like that, I think that really does mean a lot.
Charles Murray has asserted that about 10% of the American population benefits from higher education. Currently, about 50% of the population attends higher education. And so I think we're getting at a reality that we already intuited generations ago. And then in the egalitarian push that has characterized the last 60 plus years in the West, we forgot about when we pushed to have everyone get into higher education. But prior to the 60s, about 10% of the population did pursue higher education. And I think, as Jeff was getting to there, probably about 10% of the population now would benefit from it in fields like chemical engineering or high-level mathematics. But the softer stuff, all of the liberal arts degrees, the value of those, always dubious, is now not just useless, but possibly even getting into negative territory, where someone who, rather than being industrious and going and finding something useful to do or starting a side hustle or making their way in the world, instead they choose the sheltered, easy route of spending 4 or 5 or 8 years in higher education, spinning their wheels in liberal arts degrees, where they are using AI to generate all of their assignments and to do all of the work, while they extend adolescence and learn nothing other than the worst, most destructive, civilizationally destructive cultural positions. And so I say burn the whole thing down, or at least burn down most of it. Turning now to the Middle East and Israel's preemptive strike on Iran and Iran's counterattack and the fog of war and the information and misinformation, and I think we're using that term in a legitimate fashion here, because there are all kinds of reports that one can find on social media and news aggregators about how Israel is going to blow up various Iranian nuclear power plants and has killed Iranian leaders and leading nuclear physicists, and conversely that Tel Aviv is under perpetual rain of munitions from Iran that are blowing up hospitals and residential areas, and Iran is visiting on Israel what Israel has visited on Gaza, and there are videos purportedly being of both of these things, and yet there are community notes that pop up 30 minutes later identifying it as either AI generated or from something that happened previously. A lot of them that I've seen are reported to be from video games. That is a long-winded way of saying that I have no capacity to decipher what is accurate and what is not. But since I have no more information than anyone else, and the field is ripe for conjecture and speculation that time will render a judgment on, I think we will speculate some on what the outcome or potential outcomes might be, and then also talk about some of the motivations and some of the influences that are causing this conflict to play out the way that it is. Particularly, I want to visit a conversation between Texas Senator Ted Cruz and Tucker Carlson that occurred earlier this week.
And the reason is twofold. Number one, as a Christian, growing up in Sunday school, I was taught from the Bible, those who bless Israel will be blessed, and those who curse Israel will be cursed. And from my perspective, I want to be on the blessing side of things.
Of those who bless the government of Israel?
Those who bless Israel is what it says. It doesn't say the government of, it says the nation of Israel. So that's in the Bible. As a Christian, I believe that.
Where is that?
I can find it to you. I don't have the scripture off the tip of my... You pull out the phone and use the Google.
It's in Genesis. But so you're quoting a Bible phrase. You don't have context for it and you don't know where in the Bible it is, but that's like your theology? I'm confused. What does that even mean?
Tucker.
I'm a Christian. I want to know what you're talking about.
Okay. Where does my support for Israel come from? Number one, because biblically we're commanded to support Israel. But number two...
Hold on. Hold on. You're a senator, and now you're throwing out theology, and I am a Christian, and I am allowed to weigh in on this. We are commanded as Christians to support the government of Israel?
We are commanded to support Israel. And what
does that mean, Israel?
We're told those who bless Israel will be blessed.
Hold on, define Israel. This is important. Are you kidding? This is a majority Christian country.
Define Israel? Do you not know what Israel is? That would be the country you've asked like 49 questions about.
So that's what Genesis, that's what God is talking about.
The nation of Israel, yes.
And so is that the current borders, the current leadership? He's talking about the political entity called Israel?
He's talking about the nation of Israel. Yeah, nations exist, and he's discussing a nation. A nation was the people of Israel.
Is the nation
the
God's referring to in Genesis, is that the same as the country run by Benjamin Netanyahu right now?
Yes.
It is. Okay.
And by the way, it's not run by Benjamin Netanyahu as a dictator. It's a democratic country that elected.
He's the prime minister,
right?
What?
But just like, America is the country run by Donald Trump. No, actually, the American people elected Donald Trump. The same principle
This is silly. I'm talking about the political entity of modern Israel.
Yes, and that is
You believe
Israel.
That's what God was talking about in Genesis.
I do, but
that country's existed since when?
For thousands of years. Now, there was a time when it didn't exist, and then it was recreated just over 70 years ago.
I'm saying...
Ted Cruz is an intelligent guy, especially by senatorial standards. He has an enormous amount of gravitas. That's how he presents himself. That is what his brand is, that he is a smart, witty, capable debater who is able to fully flesh out why he holds the positions he does and to defend rhetorically against attacks against his position. And yet when it comes to the alleged Christian imperative of supporting the modern state of Israel, the scriptural justification that Ted Cruz gives is something that he hazily recalls from Sunday school. And the verse that Tucker Carlson was referring to and that Ted Cruz was presumably hazily pointing back to is Genesis 12:3, where God makes a covenant with Abraham, promising specifically to bless him and his descendants. Quote, "I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you," unquote. And so that verse is doing a lot of work, especially given the fact that, say, Islam, for example, traces its descendants back to Ishmael, who was one of Abraham's sons. And of course, the modern state of Israel, or maybe it's not, of course, a lot of people may not be aware of this, but the majority of Jews living in Israel today are Ashkenazi. They are predominantly European by ancestry. These are not people who are directly descended from the people who lived there 2,000 years ago. And actually, now that I'm looking, I overstated that a little bit. About half of Israeli Jews identify as Ashkenazi, while the other half as Sephardic. But as a glance at the ruling class in Israel will show, Benjamin Netanyahu being example number one, that the ruling structure in Israel is dominated by Ashkenazi Jews, and the resources from outside of the country overwhelmingly come from Ashkenazi Jews in Europe and in North America. And these are predominantly wealthy, secular, primarily ancestrally European people, not people who have a claim to direct descent from Abraham and from those in biblical times who lived in the Middle East. The argument Ted Cruz is making there is almost as silly, is as silly as referring to the Vatican today as interchangeable with the Roman authorities during scriptural times. And so the reason I allude to what a skilled debater Ted Cruz is generally and juxtapose that to the sloppy scrounging around for a bumbling answer that is not satisfactory at all is to return to a point I've made previously, which is that there really is no scriptural justification for Christian support of the modern secular state of Israel. It's not organic and it's not Christian, and that is why for over 1,800 years of Christianity's history, a position like the one that Ted Cruz is espousing here not only was not popular, but the organic Christian sentiment went in the exact opposite direction, as we've talked about here, when the Pope and the Vatican were marshaling crusading forces to rid the Holy Land of Muslim occupation, they constantly had to fight with crusaders wanting to divert the mission to attack Jewish populations all over Europe. Because the historical relationship and the spiritual understanding of Christianity for 1800 years is that Jews are enemies of Christ, killers of Christ. And if Ted Cruz seriously looked at it, he would come to the same conclusion, but he either hasn't, or if he has, he doesn't want to mention it, which is why he got so uncomfortable there, because the reality is that there just is no scriptural justification for the position that he's espousing here, and that informs Christian Zionism in the modern world.
The central figure in Christianity is, of course, Jesus Christ. And there's a lot more room of agreement between Christians and Muslims regarding Jesus than there is between Christians and Jews. So for Muslims, they view Jesus as one of the great prophets. They believe that Jesus was born to Mary miraculously. Muslims acknowledge the miracles performed by Jesus. They do deny his divinity or that he's the Son of God. They just view him as a human prophet. And they don't believe he was crucified, but they do believe, Muslims believe, that Jesus was raised to heaven by God. In contrast, Judaism does not accept Jesus as the Messiah or a prophet. He's at best a historical figure, and there are even medieval Jewish writings that present Jesus negatively. And I've even seen supposed passages in the Talmud that depict Jesus as suffering torture in hell for his sins against God. So there's not even a question that Islam has a far more favorable view of Jesus than Jews do, and yet we get people like Ted Cruz saying that it's the commandment of Christians to bless Israel, whatever that means. So they're supposed to bless the people that treated Jesus horribly and believe that he's burning in hell. And if you're curious in learning more, go back to some previous episodes. We covered in some depth, how previous Christian thinkers thought about Jews, and it does not in any way resemble the Christian Zionist views of Ted Cruz. And speaking of Christian Zionists, Mike Huckabee, who is Donald Trump's ambassador to Israel, supposedly Mike Huckabee recently sent a text message to Donald Trump, and Donald Trump has a screenshot of that text message and shared it on social media. And so this text message from Mike Huckabee to Trump is as follows. Mr. President, God spared you in Butler, Pennsylvania to be the most consequential president in a century, maybe ever. The decisions on your shoulders I would not want to be made by anyone else. You have many voices speaking to you, sir, but there is only one voice that matters, his voice. I am your appointed servant in this land and am available for you, but I do not try to get in your presence often because I trust your instinct. No president in my lifetime has been in a position like yours, not since Truman in 1945. I don't reach out to persuade you, only to encourage you. I believe you will hear from heaven, and that voice is far more important than mine or anyone else's. You sent me to Israel to be your eyes, ears, and voice, and to make sure our flag flies above our embassy. My job is to be the last one to leave. I will not abandon this post. Our flag will not come down. You did not seek this moment. This moment sought you. It is my honor to serve you. Mike Huckabee.
Mike Huckabee is 69. He was born in 1955, and he signs a text with his own full name. So that checks out to me. That is exactly what you would expect from a boomer. So I think it probably is a legitimate text.
I wonder why Mike Huckabee referenced Harry Truman. The thing that comes to mind first, as far as if you're talking about consequential big decisions, presumably he's advocate or praising Harry Truman for dropping 2 atomic bombs on Japan. And I hope that's not a subtle hint to Trump that he should deploy nuclear weapons against Iran. I don't know why, of all presidents, Mike Huckabee would choose to reference the one president who's deployed nuclear weapons. Supposedly, Trump has grown more strong in his faith since about a year ago when he was almost killed. He was shot and almost killed in Butler, Pennsylvania. But if you take it for granted that Trump is more religious, I think it's also very clear that he doesn't read generally, and certainly does, well, I shouldn't say certainly, but there's very strong indication that Trump has never read the Bible in any substantial way, or went to church on a regular basis, or is a serious theologian in any way. And so if you combine that lack of knowledge with a newfound religious fervor, people like Mike Huckabee can step into that gap and fill it. And Trump, if you told Trump that, of course, if it's a religious obligation and duty of Christians to support Israel, Trump's not going to have anything to counter that. And we see even people who I'm sure actually have read the Bible, like Ted Cruz, believe that it is the obligation of Christians to support Israel.
That might be the conclusion that they have arrived at, but I don't think that conclusion is justified by anything that they read in the Bible. Because at the risk of repeating myself again and again and again, people who spent far more time than, say, Ted Cruz ever could dream of looking at the Bible, say people like St. John Chrysostom or St. Thomas Aquinas, came to very, very different conclusions based on their long study and reading and meditation on what they read in Scripture. I wonder, too, about the play Huckabee is making in flattering Trump by telling him to trust his instincts, because at least up until the last few months, it had been consistently reported, and Trump's public statements seem to confirm as much, that Trump's instincts vis-a-vis Iran were to negotiate some sort of favorable deal for Israel and for America, but to avoid military confrontation, certainly to avoid nuclear exchange. But maybe the Pennsylvanian conversion was a sort of perverted Damascene conversion where Trump went from wanting to be a negotiator to wanting to be the God Emperor, delivering a bolt of judgment on the Persian menace. As far as how this will play out, I am struck still by how rapidly and how without really any pushback at all, Syria just crumbled last year. That was a pretty startling demonstration of how weak Iran is. That Hezbollah was an Iranian proxy is not anything that is controversial. It is well known and understood. It was something that Iran openly admitted, and the Assad regime permitted Hezbollah to operate within its borders and in the borders of neighboring Lebanon. And that had been a grievance that Israel had saber-rattled about for decades and decades. And the presumption from many in the West was that Hezbollah was much more sophisticated than anything that the West had experienced in Iraq, that they were more sophisticated operators than ISIS or the Taliban, and that if things ever got kinetic, that there would be a real problem in squaring off with Hezbollah. And yet Hezbollah melted away in Syria, and the Assad regime collapsed immediately, and Turkey and Israel took big bites out of the Syrian landmass in a way that I did not think would occur. And so I might be stung still a little bit from that, a little bit gobsmacked from it. And so my presumption, I guess I'm going to observe to see if it pans out, but my presumption, if I had to bet, would be that Israel is going to get the better of this exchange, and Iran is going to be revealed to be a hollow paper tiger when it comes to its military capabilities. And I hope that is the case, because I think the alternative, where Iran effectively starts seriously shelling Tel Aviv and Haifa and other major population centers in Israel, effectively repaying Israel for what Israel did to the Gazans over the last 2 years, if that happens, then the Israeli response is almost certainly going to be nuclear. I don't know what other response there would be for Israel. If Hamas had nuclear weapons, would they have used it on Israel at this point? It's a dark and somewhat rhetorical question. And given the carnage that Israel has visited on Gaza and the Palestinians over the last 2 years, it seems difficult to avoid the conclusion that if they feel like their backs are against the wall and their major cities are being shelled and they're losing electricity and sewage and hospital services and infrastructure is crumbling under a relentless Iranian counterattack that's been promised by Iran, that Israel wouldn't respond with a nuclear strike or a set of nuclear strikes. And so I think anything other than a decisive Israeli victory in this iteration of the conflict in the Middle East between Israel and Iran is going to potentially lead to a nuclear exchange. This week, Glenn Greenwald was lamenting what he perceived to be the war drum rhetoric, whipping the public into a war frenzy in support of an imminent attack on Iran by the United States. He lamented that Americans haven't learned anything over the last generation, because he sees the same thing playing out again in 2025 with regards to America's military action against Iran that occurred in 2003 when America invaded Iraq and overthrew Saddam Hussein. And that immediately struck me as off. I follow public polling pretty closely, and there is a huge difference in terms of the level of support for American military action against Iran in 2025 compared to where public support was for the invasion of Iraq in 2003. 2003, ahead of the invasion, 64% of Americans supported boots on the ground in Iraq, compared to a YouGov poll released this week asking about American military action against Iran, without even specifying boots on the ground. This is just, quote, "Do you think the U.S. military should get involved in the conflict between Israel and Iran?" unquote. So that's far less committal than the question that was being asked in March of 2003 ahead of the Iraq invasion. And just 16% of Americans say that they support the U.S. military getting involved in a military action against Iran. So 2/3 of the population supported the war in Iraq, but just about 1 in 8 supports a similar war in Iran. And so that should presumably make Glenn Greenwald happy that the public does seem to have either learned or just had fatigue or lost any sort of sense of pride in America, military and adventurism in general. Whatever the cause of the vast difference a generation makes in terms of public support for military action in the Middle East and in Central Asia, the reality, I think, quite cynically, is that massive difference in public support doesn't really matter one way or the other. If Trump elects not to escalate further against Iran, I don't think it will be because there isn't a lot of public support for it. And I certainly don't think if he decides with neocon backing and neoliberal backing to escalate the conflict in Iran and get the United States directly involved, I do not think the fact that the vast majority of Americans don't support that will stop it from happening. And so the white pill way to look at this is, hey, over the last 25 years, the scales have fallen from a lot of people's eyes, and they have access to information to prevent them from being hoodwinked in the same way that they were 25 years ago. But of course, the black-pilled way to look at that same situation is that even though now people are red-pilled on military adventurism, ultimately it doesn't matter, because no matter who you elect, you end up with the foreign policy of John McCain. From America to Israel and back to America again. Next Tuesday, voting in the Democratic primary mayoral contest in New York City takes place. It's something we've discussed here previously, and I was, and I think still am, of the opinion that Cuomo will make his triumphant political return, and that the pretense about how the Me Too movement meant that he was politically radioactive was nonsense, and that the establishment will elevate someone and then throw them in the garbage and then pick them out of the garbage and dust them off and clean them and present them again as smelling like roses as the situation dictates, and that nothing is really ever forever when it comes to the establishment's minions. But the public polling has tightened. The latest polling shows Cuomo with about a 10-point advantage, winning 55 to 45%.
We'll discuss this at a later episode. My prediction, Mamdani's going to win. He's the Indian Muslim who's running against Andrew Cuomo. He's got a lot of charisma. He's gone after Cuomo pretty hard, landing some blows regarding his sexual deviancy and his disaster with moving old people into COVID-positive old people into nursing home. New York, since 2019, I believe, or maybe, no, I think it was, they started using it in 2021, rank choice voting. And I'm not exactly sure how that works, but it certainly throws a wrench into things in terms of predicting what's going to happen. So I think the second and third ranked candidates in polling right now, just Mamdani and the guy below him, they just issued a joint endorsement of each other. So they're asking their supporters to make the other candidate their number 2 choice. And so with that in mind, and then you also add on top of this Eric Adams, the black current mayor of New York City. He's running as an independent. Now, that won't have any effect on the Democratic primary, but directly at least. But you throw that in there, that might change some people's calculations on how they're going to vote. So all that adds up to, I think, a very unpredictable race. But I'm going to go on the record, and not as super strong. I don't feel strongly about it, but I'm going to predict that Mamdani's going to pull this out. And Mamdani's some of his platform items include opening up a government-run grocery store as well as rent control. That is telling landlords that they are not allowed to raise the rents on their tenants, regardless of myriad market forces that would necessitate increased rents.
And if landlords can't raise rents, then they make up the difference by refusing to put any maintenance into the units that they can't charge anything profitable from, and the inevitable consequence is a reduction in the amount of available housing and the degradation of the existing housing stock. And as someone who is happy to see New York City crumble, I hope that Mamdani wins, but I think that Cuomo will. And Jeff mentioned that Cuomo's fatal treatment of the elderly during COVID as a reason that Cuomo's supports might be a little bit shaky. And while I don't disagree with the thrust of that point, it is interesting to note that Cuomo will almost certainly win among older voters, and Mamdani will win among younger voters. I think the election, often local elections, serve as proxies for the general cultural sentiments of the country. And I think if Cuomo loses, it will signal a real weakening of the Israel lobby's influence on American politics and culture. That'll do it for us this week. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.